I speak to you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Contracts, they're all around us. Bring your car into the shop and they print out what is essentially a contract saying that this is the amount of work that will be done and then you will pay this amount of money. Once signed, the shop has an obligation to do the work, and if they discover more work needs to be done, then they need to check in with you and get your permission before they can continue to do any extras. It's a simple contract. Party A will do all of this work at a specified cost, and Party B will pay that cost when the project is completed. And then there are other contracts that are far more complicated and involved, and they're all drawn up with the help of lawyers. And Party A is responsible for a whole list of things. Party B is responsible for another list of things. And then there are constraints and obligations and things that can make this contract null and void if people don't do their part. And then we look at them and we say, well, if they're entered into with two willing and honest parties, how do these contracts go astray? That's because of human frailty. Human frailties can mean that obligations to a contract or to relationships go unmet, and things that are harmful in those relationships or contracts can be done. And then yet again, there are contracts that are entered into unfaithfully with the idea that they're intended to be broken. Party A puts in restrictions and loopholes such that they can cancel the contract or a whim or commit fraud against Party B without any penalties. So sometimes you have to wonder, are contracts really worth the paper they're written on? Today we read an account of God making an agreement with Abraham. Essentially an agreement that God will bless Abraham and give Abraham children, and Abraham will leave his home and he will follow God and he will trust and continue with God in faith. A contract. It looks like one, but actually it's more than that. It's a covenant. A covenant is one in which, this covenant between God and Abraham is one in which God promises fidelity to Abraham. And a lot of blessings that include being the father of many nations. And Abraham agrees to have and live with fidelity to God. Yet that isn't always what happened. Today, we read the account from Genesis where God reaffirmed the covenant. A lot has happened in the intervening years. Many times Abraham has lost faith. He has lied. He has manipulated. He has tried in his own power to make God's promises come true in his life. And yet, the covenant is not broken. God comes to assure Abraham of this fact. You will have a son, and you will name him Isaac. And this promise starts to have more details now than it did in the beginning. Throughout all of the encounters between God and Abraham, the covenant is reaffirmed and there are more details. Over and over again, we hear God use the phrase, "As for me, I will." We see this covenant becoming more and more one-sided. Not that Abraham doesn't have a part, but that God does not hold Abraham's lapses against him, and yet always affirms that he, God, will be faithful. We see this not just in the case of Abraham, but throughout all of history. The first time was after the flood. "As for me," says God, "I promise that I will never again destroy the whole earth with a flood." And in that promise, there are no expectations that humans will be able or willing to live a sin-free life. God's promise just is. And the sign and the seal of this promise is a rainbow that comes out whenever there's rain as a reminder to God to keep his covenant and honor it. Now, whereas contracts are more like business arrangements, God's covenant is a family relationship. There's love. There's belonging. There's the knowledge on God's part that the people he loves will not always be faithful. And it does not alter God's commitment to the covenant. In fact, human disobedience simply causes God to double down. Year after year, decade after decade, God reassures Abraham with this promise. Despite discouragement and doubt and trying to take matters into his own hands, somehow Abraham does hold out with a little bit of faith. And because Abraham's faith is counted as righteousness, God continues to bring his blessing to all people through Abraham and through Isaac. Yet in Isaac's young life, we already begin to see the ways in which God is providing for more grace and expanding that covenant. When God requires that Abraham bring him an offering and promises to provide the offering, we see Abraham in confidence going up the mountain with the wood for the sacrifice, confident that God will provide. And when Abraham does not readily see the offering, he prepares to give back to God the treasured gift of God's love. How much trust did that take? How much faith did that take? Was there fear? Did Abraham wonder if giving Isaac back to God would engender another 50 years or more of childlessness? Regardless of how many times Abraham failed God, argued with God, lied, cheated and manipulated, all it takes for God to remember the covenant is a simple act of faith. And then God provides the sacrifice, and a ram appears tangled in the bushes. Generation after generation, we see the blessing of the covenant played out, despite the wandering feet and wavering faith of the people. God continues to provide his wisdom and his blessing in daily life as he provides for them in birth and death, marriage and family, injustice and oppression. Joseph was sent ahead to save his family from the famine. Moses was sent back to lead his people out of oppression. And when the people continued to sin, the priests were there to help them bring sin offerings and sacrifices. And God counts it as faith and righteousness, and he keeps his promises. Is there a pattern emerging here? Does God work harder on blessing the people even as the people do not always keep their side of the covenant? In Leviticus, God declares, "I shall be your God, and you shall be my people." Then even as he lists all the reasons why his people are not behaving as his people, he affirms his part in that relationship. Yes, he does say that he is displeased, but the promise does not waver. I will be your God, and you will be my people. And in it all, God keeps planning for more ways to provide more for the people, more ways to be faithful in his promises, more ways to expand the covenant. Ultimately, God substitutes his own faithfulness for our lack of faithfulness as he gives us salvation in Jesus. Yet it really is what God has been doing all along, bringing his faithfulness into our relationship with him as he redeems us from the flood and from the plagues and from oppression and from the famine and from our own lostness as we wander in sin. Again and again, God provides the covenant and proves that the covenant cannot be broken, that he will not ever leave his people without his protection, his love, and his grace. Ultimately, God himself dies and pays the penalty for sin in the person of Jesus. Again, the promise and the blessing remain on all of the people. Now God sees the rainbow and the cross and the empty tomb as reminders of his deep love for us. I will be your God, and you will be my people. Do you ever wonder, though, does God really need those reminders? Are those reminders for God's benefit or for ours? We look at the symbols that remind us of our faith, and we see how deeply, how intimately God has held to his part of the covenant. God's love is endless. God's mercy never comes to an end. God's love does not have conditions other than that we remember the gift he's given us in Jesus. And no matter how often we forget or how far we stray, it only takes a breath and a heartbeat for God's blessing to come flooding back into our lives. Abraham was not perfect, but he was the first individual for whom God reverses human alienation and provides mercy based solely on the trust of that individual. We look at Abraham's life and we see so much that makes us wonder. And yet God looks at Abraham and sees only his faith. That refrain of love and blessing echoes throughout the generations. Take, for example, David, about as flawed as anybody can be. Yet he repents, he learns, and he accepts God's guidance. And what does God call him? A man after my own heart. As for me, I shall be your God, and you shall be my people. Have you noticed that in this covenant, God keeps both sides of the promise? I shall be your God, therefore I will see you, I will love you, I will care for you, I will guide you, and I will have mercy on you simply because you're my people. Our place as God's people is not dependent upon us. It's not even dependent upon what we do. It is solely born of God's love. Time after time, God reminds us of that promise, and yet he never coerces us to obey. I shall be your God, and you shall be my people. This is my covenant, and I will bless you in it. Despite human flaws and failings, God continues to show his grace. Abraham is counted as a man of faith because he responded in faith in spite of flaws and failings. David was a man after God's own heart in spite of his flaws and failings. You and I, we are God's beloved children in spite of our flaws and failings. In this covenant, God does all the work. When we reach out to God, we are counted among the righteous, and we only have to believe in order to reap all of the benefits of his love and grace. The commentators in the Spiritual Formation Bible say that God's covenant was given to an individual, Abraham, and extended to include all of Abraham's dysfunctional family, and that in every generation God reminds us of his covenant. In Jesus, God brings all of us into Abraham's dysfunctional family, establishing and preserving the covenant. Despite our weak, sinful nature, our unformed character, and our human attempts to manipulate the outcomes of grace. We didn't earn it, we can't lose it, and yet it's ours. As close as our breath uttered in prayer, as strong and as steady as our heartbeats. We see the evidence of that on the cross, where Jesus prayed, "Forgive them." And even as his heartbeat waned, he cried, "It is finished." In that instant, we were forever guaranteed that we are children of the promise and heirs of the blessing. It's no wonder that the psalmist proclaims, "Posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people as yet unborn, he has done it." He is our God, and we are his people. And nothing in heaven or on earth or under the earth can change that. God's covenant is eternal. Praise be to God. Amen.